Hello friends, it's Michael Kingswood and it's story time on Saturday for Story Saturday. And I know what you're thinking, Kingswood, where the hell you been? Undigging from a lot of stuff. It's been a very discombobulated year so far, but we are at least in the process of getting ourselves back squared away. And part of the ways we're doing that is getting back to story time. As I promised you the last time, we are doing this year the stories from last year. 52 stories in 2023. We're doing volume 1 right now. Should be well into volume 2, but life roll. Anyway, last time we did the Nose for Tacos. This time we're doing Cosmic Pizza. And this story is exactly what it sounds like. It's cosmic horror. And it involves pizza. So, I liked it because I wrote it and because it's fun. You'll like it because I wrote it and because it's fun. So let's just get to it. It was a short order pizza parlor. A million others like it, scattered throughout cities all over the country. Hell, all over the world as far as Jeff knew. There were half a dozen booths on the left wall as he walked in, large enough to seat 4, 6 if you were friendly, and upholstered with red naugahyde. To the right, a quartet of red tablecloth tables with straight-back chairs for 6 around each. Directly ahead, a darkly stained countertop with a cash register on the left and a fountain drink dispenser with 8 nozzles to the right. The counter ended just past the register, allowing egress to the rear, where a brick oven stove dominated the rear wall of the cooking space. Cooling racks and white countertops provided workspace for the staff, and it looked like there was a little alcove way back and to the left for a pair of restrooms. The place smelled of baking bread, mozzarella, and tomato sauce and felt warmly welcoming, except for the dead body at the last table to the right. The man was seated with his back to the wall. He looked to be in his mid-30s, in good shape, like he went to the gym regularly. He had on blue jeans and a blue and white plaid flannel shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. His black hair was cut short on the sides and back, but longer on top, flopping over the right side of his head jauntily. He would have been a good-looking guy except for the butcher knife sticking out of the center of his chest. He was slumped back in his chair, his head lolled back so it contacted the wall. His eyes were wide in final shock, and his mouth hung slackly open, half-chewed pizza still visible within. The slice he had been eating was still mostly clenched in his right hand, now flopped onto the tabletop next to his plate. The rest of his pizza was on a raised platform in the center of his table, between his plate and that of his date across the table from him. Hawaiian pizza looked like. Jeff wanted to shudder at the thought, but suppressed the impulse, professional stoicism overriding the natural revulsion that abomination against nature and good taste wanted to evoke within him. The man's date was at a different table now, closer to the door, and curled up on herself as she pulled the emergency blanket a paramedic had given her tightly about herself. She was crying uncontrollably, even now a good hour or so after the incident. Her mascara had run so that her cheeks were streaks of black, and her dirty blonde hair, once clearly done up nicely, or at least coherently, into a bun, was now haphazard, with strings and strands popping out every which way. A guy Jeff didn't recognize from the patrol division was sitting next to her, his notepad open, and a look of exasperated patience on his face, but it was clear she wasn't saying anything worthwhile. 2 more patrol officers had another man cornered in the second booth from the rear on the left side, though maybe cornered wasn't the right word for it. He was handcuffed and seated in the couch's bench seat facing the door. He had the red polo shirt that marked him as an employee of the pizza parlor and long, stringy brown hair that tumbled down the sides of his face to his shoulders. A short, stubbly beard framed his face, and spittle was running down his chin. He was bumping in the bench seat, moving jerkily forward and backward, and his wide eyes were unfocused, staring at the tabletop in front of himself as he mouthed rapid words that Jeff couldn't hear from this distance. His face was streaked with blood, as were his arms beneath the sleeves of his polo shirt. The perp, apparently. Jeff took him in at a glance, but quickly looked back toward the victim and the patrol sergeant who was just standing from looking him over. He was mid-40s, of age with Jeff, and starting to go a bit fat beneath the crisp blues of his uniform, but his dark gray eyes were hard, sharp with intelligence beneath the curly black hair on his head. Sergeant Dearborn nodded greeting as Jeff stepped toward him. "Evening, Detective," Dearborn said. This is a weird one. Jeff returned the nod. What do you have, Tom? Dearborn gestured toward the dead man. Name's Clifford Simek. He's here with his girlfriend. He didn't point toward the sobbing woman, but he didn't need to, and they're having pizza. Shocker. Dearborn's stoic facade cracked for a second as he raised a wry eyebrow Jeff's way. Jeff just returned it deadpan for a second, and Dearborn sniffed softly, almost a chuckle. Almost. Anyway, this guy, he pointed toward the bobbing guy in the booth, comes out from the kitchen with that knife, walks right up and stabs Simek in the chest, cold as ice. Then he just stands there, looking at him as Simek dies. Jeff waited a couple seconds. Dearborn didn't say anything else, so he made a get-on-with-it gesture with his right hand. Then what? Dearborn shrugged. Nothing. The other customers called 911, and when my guys showed up, he was still standing there, just staring at Simek and drooling. He glanced over at the girl. Before she broke down, she told Hassan the perp said something like into below right before he stabbed Simek. Jeff frowned, then looked over at the girl. She had not improved noticeably since he started talking with Dearborn, still obviously in no condition to give a coherent statement. How many other people were here? 2 other couples on dates, Dearborn said. 3 guys on their own who just came in. 1 cook, a cashier, and an assistant in back. No manager? Dearborn nodded toward the perp. He's the manager. Jason Linsky, son of the owner, from what the cashier said. Jeff looked back at the bobbing man in the booth and spent a bit more time looking him over. He was early 20s or had a respectably proficient baby face. Fit enough, not a gym rat, but not a couch potato either. Average Joe, basically. As the owner showed up, out of town till the end of the week, Dearborn said. Bakinski called him, but got a voicemail. Well, that at least meant Jeff wouldn't have interference with his investigation for a couple days. There would be no trouble getting a warrant for the entire premises. It was a crime scene, but the owner would object to keeping it closed to business longer than absolutely necessary. Understandable, but Jeff hated artificial deadlines attached to his cases, and especially his crime scenes. He couldn't say for certain, but he had strong suspicion at least 3 scumbags he had tried to put away had walked because he'd been forced out of the crime scene earlier than he should have been. Not this time, though, hopefully. Jeff nodded. What happened to the other witnesses? Took their initial statements, got their information, and sent them home. Told them we'd be in touch in the morning. Made sense. It was getting on toward 10 o'clock, and the security camera Jeff saw in the right front corner of the room would be at least as valuable as anything they had to say. Jeff pointed toward the girl. She's unhurt. Her father's on the way to pick her up. Figured we'd let her go. She's not much good to us the way she is right now. Jeff nodded agreement. They could always interview her tomorrow. Better a good statement than a hysterical one that a defense could pick apart for contradictions later on. Back to the perp. He hadn't moved from his perch on the couch's bench seat, except to keep bobbing back and forth, forward and back. Now, was Jeff seeing things, or was it always the exact same distance forward and back? Weird. He gestured toward Linsky, and Dearborn frowned. I called psych. They've got some people coming with the coroner's office to take him. He paused, then lowered his voice. I'll tell you, Jeff, I've never seen a perp like this guy. The things he's babbling? Jeff looked back at him and raised a questioning eyebrow. Dearborn shrugged and waved toward the perp with his left hand. Hear for yourself. Frowning, Jeff took him up on the offer and walked a few paces over to the booth where Linsky sat. The 2 patrol officers with him perked up a bit as Jeff got closer. The closer one, the younger of the 2, with a round dark face and a shaved head that reflected the light from the parlor's overhead lights like a cue ball, looked at Jeff with a perplexed expression. Don't make no sense, Detective, the young patrolman said. Jeff was about to nod agreement. Then he heard the words streaming out of Linsky's mouth and realized the patrolman wasn't talking about the crime. From the void to the beyond bless he who walks in the shadows of the blood and the fist of heaven who comes on the winds of shadow in the sweetness of the sour and the twisting of the straight. May he never fail in his oblivion, though the winds of time blow to zero and on, a stream of words that evoked images in Jeff's mind, but no coherent meaning. Just an apparently endless stream of inanity that somehow almost touched upon making sense. The kind of sense that made Jeff's mind rebel in even contemplating it. He had to stop himself from recoiling from the man and the strangely meaningful gibberish he was spewing. The fist of heaven who comes on the winds of shadow. Jeff forced himself to stillness and swallowed. Has he been like this the whole time? Cue Ball nodded, licking his lips. Pretty much. Sykes on the way? Another nod. Good. Dearborn was right. This was a weird one. Looking at Linsky sitting there, bobbing and babbling, Jeff got a crawling sensation up his spine, and he could not entirely suppress a shudder. A really weird one. Linsky was in a white straitjacket, sitting Indian-style in his 10x10 padded isolation room, with his head resting against the wall's padding so that he was staring, unblinking, up into the left far corner of the room. He no longer continued his inane but somehow sensical babble, but his eyes remained unfocused. But it wasn't like he wasn't seeing something, it was like he was staring transfixed at something over in that direction, something that commanded his attention without release. Jeff left the side of the orderly who had admitted him into the psych holding cell and stepped over to Linsky's side. He didn't respond to Jeff's presence. Jeff squatted down and bent over to put his head next to Linsky's, then he turned to follow the perp's gaze. Nothing, just the seams in the padding where the ceiling met the two adjoining walls in the corner that the perp was staring at fixedly. Jeff stood back up and looked at the orderly and the attending physician who stood behind and to the orderly's right. The two men could have been made from a mold, same height, just slightly above average, same clothing, blue scrubs with ID badges clipped to the left breast, same pitying, yet also condescending expressions on their face when they looked at Linsky. They varied only in skin tone and hair color. The orderly was pale, ginger, the attending sub-Saharan black, with curling black hair cut so it only curled out even with his earlobes. "He's been staring at that same point since he came in?" Jeff asked. The attending, Dr. Akawi, nodded. "He only stopped talking about 3 hours ago, but since then he's been completely silent, and he resists all efforts to feed him or give him water." Jeff gave a double take, then looked harder at Akawi. "Come again? He won't let you feed him?" Akawi shrugged and looked down at Linsky. "I misspoke. He doesn't resist. He simply does not cooperate, at all. We give him food, and he does not chew or swallow. Water, and he lets it overflow his mouth. No attempt at ingestion at all." Akawi frowned. It's as though he cannot register what's happening, or just doesn't care. He lifted his eyes to meet Jeff's. "We will have to resort to intravenous feeding soon if he does not relent." Jeff frowned deeply, then turned to look back at the perp. He had not budged even a smidgen of an inch in the time Jeff had been in his padded holding cell, not even when Jeff had practically been pressing his head next to his. Really, really weird. Tom Dearborn was the supervisor in charge of the patrol team that met Jeff at Linsky's apartment to serve the search warrant. The landlord probably would have let him in without the warrant, from the way he had practically spit on the floor when Jeff mentioned Linsky's name, from the way he had not even waited to see the paperwork before he had opened the locked key storage locker on the wall adjacent to his desk, and then led the way up 3 flights of stairs to the front door of Linsky's place, and from the eager gleam in his eyes when Jeff had thanked him for his assistance. No doubt he would have done it, but again, the defense. Jeff had to cross every T, dot every I, so he did. Not that he needed convincing. He didn't begrudge defendants their rights. He knew a guy who had been railroaded by the same DA Jeff had worked with on a dozen cases or more. Dude was a scumbag. But a scumbag representing the people, and no matter how he had boned Jeff's acquaintance, it was the jury who had handed down the verdict. And that DA had also put hundreds of worse scumbags behind bars where they belonged. Still, Jeff made a point of not ever crossing the line on interviews or collecting evidence. Just because the DA was scum didn't mean the rest of the investigation didn't have to be legit, or at least that's how Jeff saw it. So he'd spent the 10 minutes to write the paperwork and brief the judge to get his search warrant. Really, the judge never would have denied it. Not for Linsky, not under the circumstances of the case. Then Dearborn's men made sure all 3 rooms in Linsky's apartment were clear, and it was off to work. It didn't take long to find the smoking gun. Or maybe not? "What the hell is that?" Dearborn said at Jeff's side when the two of them opened the sliding doors of Linsky's bedroom closet and looked inside. Really, really weird didn't even begin to cut it. This was weird times 1,000 squared, then squared again for good measure. There were no clothes hanging from the hooks in the closet. Just a table that had been converted into a makeshift altar, turning the entire closet into a shrine of sorts. But a shrine to what, Jeff could not figure. There were strange glyphs painted everywhere on the interior of the closet walls, swirling, yet also jagged, seemingly twisting around themselves into meaningless squiggles, but at the same time oddly structured. Like if you were looking at it from precisely the right angle, it would all make sense. But not from any angle Jeff could find from within the closet, or from the bedroom outside either. No matter how he looked at the red and black and green and blue and yellow lines, swirling and jagging and twisting and squaring and breaking around each other, it never became any more clear. But yet it should have. Part of Jeff's mind knew it had to be, and he felt as he looked at it that he was just on the edge of comprehending if only he could see. "Check this out, Detective," Dearborn said, and Jeff jerked back to reality, to the now. How long had he been staring at those glyphs? How long had he been contemplating the strange pseudo-structure within them? He glanced down at his watch and saw that only half a minute had passed since they opened the closet doors. It felt like a short eternity. Dearborn was bent over the table to Jeff's left, where somehow in his contemplation of the glyphs he had completely missed a leather-bound book open on a reading pedestal next to half a dozen red wax candles arranged around a pentagram inlaid into the top of the table in paint that looked almost like real silver. Jeff inched over next to Dearborn and looked down to where the sergeant's index finger was pointing down onto the text of the book. The page was yellowed from age, curling slightly at the edge. It was thicker than the other kinds of paper Jeff had seen, and rippled and textured almost like leather. The writing on the page was in a language he didn't know, but it was at the same time smooth and jagged, like the glyphs painted into the closet walls. But Jeff didn't need to be able to read the script to decipher the drawing on the open page in front of him. It clearly depicted an altar in a clearing, surrounded by a circle of 6 cowled figures. A 7th cowled person stood next to the altar with his hands thrown up toward the sky. An 8th figure was sprawled atop the altar, staring wide-eyed up into the sky above, his jaw slack. A long, broad-bladed knife was plunged nearly hilt-deep into his chest. Jeff wasn't a forensics expert, but to his eye it looked to be in exactly the same place the knife had been thrust into Simek's chest in the pizza parlor. Jeff breathed out a long, low whistle. Beside him, Dearborn nodded agreement. He looked sidelong at Jeff. "Looks like he was reenacting the ritual." He paused, then looked back at the book and shrugged. Or at least he thought he was. He's clearly bonkers. Maybe he somehow thought his father's pizza place was a hilltop with an altar. That made sense, kind of, but also it was a stretch. Linsky was clearly out of it now, but could he really have been that far gone at the time of the murder that he really didn't know he was in a pizza parlor, not in a clearing in the middle of a forest? That seemed a stretch. And anyway, it was a stretch that would just put him into an insane asylum instead of prison. An asylum is worse than prison, a not-so-quiet part of Jeff's mind replied. And true enough, but that would also mean declaring him legally not guilty due to insanity, and Jeff rebelled against letting a murderer escape on even that small amount of accountability for his crime. "There has to be more to it," Jeff said. Dearborn continued looking at him for a second, then shrugged. "You say so. I'll check the rest of the room." He turned away and walked over to Linsky's dresser on the other side of the room from the closet. That left Jeff alone with the book and the altar setup. He just looked at the strangely almost leather pages and the flowing script on them for a moment, and again he felt drawn into those weird designs. Something pulled at him, bidding him to look deeper, closer. Turn the page, see the next secret. Instead, Jeff turned to the page before the one Linsky had been reading. Just more flowing and graceful but jagged and harsh script, pointing toward something half-seen yet totally hidden. He turned backwards again and stopped, shock paralyzing his muscles into complete immobility, so he could not even breathe for a second that stretched into 10, and then 15, before he finally was able to force himself to expel the breath he had been holding without even realizing it. He inhaled then, loudly enough that from the corner of his eye he saw Dearborn stiffen and then spin toward him, the sergeant's hand coming to rest instinctively on the grip of his weapon holstered on his belt. Jeff didn't bother with the explanations. He just gestured forcefully for Dearborn to come back over to him. "What?" The question died on Dearborn's lips when he saw the drawing on the page Jeff had turned to. It couldn't have been the same thing. The book was obviously hundreds of years old, at least. So whoever had drawn this image into it could not have intentionally made it match so exactly. But nevertheless, there it was, in the book 2 page turns back from the drawing of the sacrifice. A furnace or some equivalent, but whatever it was the exact replica of the wood-fired oven in Linsky's pizza parlor. As before, the diagram seemed to grab at Jeff, and it was with no small amount of effort that he forced his eyes away to look Dearborn in the face. "We need to get back there, have a look at that thing." The sergeant nodded. "And we're bringing this with us," Jeff added by instinct, placing his hand down atop the strange book. Dearborn paused, hesitating plainly as his instinct to preserve the scene and maintain the integrity of evidence clashed with something else, something primal, almost spiritual, a desire, a need, a nigh irresistible drawing to see, to know that Jeff could see and fully relate to. After a second that felt an eternity, Dearborn nodded. Jeff closed the book, and they left with it. The pizza parlor was still taped off when Jeff and Dearborn arrived. They drove separately, since it would have been a pain to bring Dearborn back to his supervisor cruiser at Linsky's, and anyway he might get a call while they were at the parlor. Dearborn looked surprised when they came to the door and found it taped off, though. "I thought it had been released already." Jeff flashed a grin at him. "Technically, yes. But Mr. Linsky doesn't get back till midnight, and he won't be able to open up till tomorrow afternoon no matter what. So I had them leave the tape up, just in case." Jeff pulled the tape off from the front door and pushed it open, and stepped inside. He could feel Dearborn hesitate in following. Driven by disapproval? Didn't matter, there was nothing illegal about what Jeff had done, not technically anyway, so they were clear, for now at least. Good thing, too. If they'd discovered the book and altar even just a few hours later, it would have been a heck of a pain to explain to the elder Linsky, let alone to a judge, why they needed to get back inside to search. Again. Just as well that it wasn't needed. The inside of the parlor was dark, fitting for the growing darkness of afternoon fading into evening, combined with the fact that the lights were all turned off. But dark as it was somehow infused with a kind of light, so Jeff found he could see almost normally. It was like being in a room with lights on a dimmer that had been turned down to just above their fully dark setting, so a person could see everything but not be entirely sure that he could. Part of Jeff's mind, a large part, told him just to hit the light switch to the left of the door as he stepped inside. But somehow, for some reason that made sense even though it was ludicrous, he reasoned it would be better to not do that right now. After all, he could see. And they didn't need light for what they'd come to complete, did they? Wait, complete? "My God," Dearborn said from Jeff's left. He looked at the sergeant and saw that Dearborn's gaze was fixed toward the rear of the parlor, past the countertop toward the work and serving spaces back there. Now Jeff realized there was more light coming from back there, and yet as he glanced to his right and then back toward the door, he saw that the light did not illuminate anything. To either side of himself and behind, it was all twilight gloom into full dark, no matter that he could see. Looking back forward again, though, ahead, vision was clear and complete. A dark, not light that nevertheless revealed all shone forth. Now clearly coming from something to the right of the oven, on the work counters Jeff had seen in his initial survey of the scene seemingly an eternity ago, even though it had been less than 2 days since then. Dearborn had started moving forward, toward the gap to the left of the service counter that led into the kitchen areas. Jeff followed because that was why they had come, after all. When he passed the counter, it seemed that the space shifted somehow. Where he knew the kitchen area was relatively small, enough so that the cashier plus cook plus assistant accounted for all of the people who could comfortably be back there under normal conditions. Now it seemed that the length of the space from where he was to the oven head must be nearly 100 feet. And over to the work counters on the right, half of that. Jeff's mind rejected that idea. He clearly had memory of this space being much smaller, but his perception could not deny it. The size of the space, its feeling of immensity, it overwhelmed his memory's protest. A new scent was on the air, different from the sense of baking and pizza and merriment that he knew before. Now it was sharper, tangy, but also rank, like something that should be good lingered here, but had gotten rotten. The not light grew stronger, shining an orange-green tint on the scene that was even now morphing before Jeff's eyes. The kitchen apparatus was fading, the counter behind losing reality, fading into mist. The oven remained. the actual mechanism to light its fire on the wall next to it, as well, solid in its reality. The work counter as well, though its white top was shifting into gray-blue, almost like stone of its own. There was something lying atop the counter, something paler, but Jeff couldn't make it out. Dearborn walked over to the lighting mechanism next to the oven, somehow covering 100 feet with a single pace, and flipped the switch. The oven came to life, an internal fire leaping up from the burner within to shrieks that almost sounded like men and women screaming that suddenly echoed in Jeff's mind. He stumbled backward, losing grip on the book as he reflexively pressed his palms to his ears. The shrieks were so loud. Dearborn crossed the distance back in another step and stopped, looking at Jeff quizzically. "You okay, detective?" He sounded his normal self, but his face was twisting, like bubbles flowing beneath his flesh were running up one side of his head and down the other. His skin grew more pink than red, and when he smiled, his eyes flashed red for a second. Then a second later, he was back to his normal self, the same man Jeff had worked with, gotten a drink with, for almost 20 years. Tom, Jeff tried to say, but found it only came out in a croak. Like his vocal cords could not bear to give voice to thoughts that he couldn't begin to put in order. Dearborn smiled at him. "It's all good, Jeff," and he bent down to pick up the book. "Linsky botched the ceremony," he continued as he straightened, and there was an undertone to his voice that Jeff could not put his finger on. Dearborn was always more bass than baritone, but now there were throbbing levels even below that. Levels that Jeff could feel but not hear. Levels that impacted on his very mind, and he felt a rising revulsion tinged with terror. Yet at the same time he found himself petrified to the spot, stuck the same way he had been when he examined the glyphs in Linsky's closet. Something about the new, deeper resonances of Dearborn's voice reflected and harmonized and combined and opposed and reinforced each other, and created a dissonant harmony that reverberated through Jeff's very soul, so he could only stand there gaping at the ugly, abhorrent, and yet completely inescapably sublime, repellent beauty of each word as Dearborn stepped closer to the counter. "The sacrifice cannot be consummated until the vessel is complete," Dearborn said. And not Dearborn, as once again Jeff got a flash of something else, some alien thing bubbling beneath the man, working to overwhelm the sergeant and burst through into being of its own. But yet it couldn't. That insight flashed through Jeff's being in a heartbeat as the truth of it reverberated from the intonation of the thing within Dearborn's words. Not without completion. Until then it was trapped. "You and I can complete the work, though," Dearborn said, and picked up the object that had been lying on the countertop. He turned back toward Jeff, and his eyes were fully red now, red and hot. Jeff felt the heat of his gaze as Dearborn turned. Or maybe it was just the heat of the oven. Jeff couldn't be sure. He was sure about the thing in Dearborn's right hand, though. Not a butcher knife like Linsky had used on his customer. A broad-bladed dagger like the one in the drawing Jeff had found within the book. The book! Where was... Then he saw it, atop the counter where Dearborn had placed it to take up the dagger. And it was glowing with the same knot light that had lit the place up when they walked in. The same, and yet dim, a shadow of the shadowy light that was already shining, like it was the junior partner. Jeff's eyes moved up the wall from the counter and saw the source, the thing that had produced the knot light to begin with. Long and flat in a cooling rack above the counter, flat and round, it glowed in that dark light, brighter and yet devoid of brightness so that Jeff could not bear to look at it at first. But after a few blinks to clear the intensity, he saw the light wasn't coming from the entire disk, but from a dozen or more smaller pieces atop it. As his mind and eye opened to that fact, he realized what he was looking at, and the absurdity of it took him aback. "Wait, Tom, the vessel is a pizza?" Dearborn paused, looked back at the disk and the object atop it. The red of his eyes flickered, then resumed, and a twisted smile appeared on his face. "Do you still not see?" Then he was across the space between them, and he had his left hand around Jeff's throat. It was like being in a vice. The iron strength of his fingers betrayed any hope of ever considering breaking his grip. Dearborn, or the thing that inhabited what had once been Dearborn, pulled his face down to itself, and Jeff gasped at the sudden pain from the scorching heat of its breath. "Fool," it said. Then it flung Jeff away, its fingers around his throat picking him up until he left his feet. He flew across the space until he struck something solid and landed on his side atop the counter beneath the cooling rack. The rest of the space was now completely orange-red mist, except for the oven at what had been the rear. Whatever coolness of evening had faded between a dry heat that was growing more oppressive by the moment. The pleasant scents of the pizza parlor, replaced by sulfur and dirty smoke, rot and decay. Hauntingly dark melody gone, replaced by mournful groans and screams, but screams that somehow had a measure of ecstasy intermixed with their agony. All twisted, all wrong, all beautiful, all enticing. Jeff lay on his side and groaned, trying to wrap his mind around what was happening and failing, trying to figure out how to survive and not wanting to, struggling to comprehend, and finding at the end of that road a void and a blackness and a dark light and a consumption and an eternity piled upon infinity, piled upon universes consumed by nothingness, overarched by a cold and meaningless lack of anything resembling thought or caring or desire, just an all-sucking singularity that consumed everything and produced everything and left nothing remaining but insanity, and gifted nothing that was love, but also yearned and hungered for nothingness that was the only thing that could feed it as it swelled into immensity but shrank into oblivion at the same time. And Jeff realized he was screaming at the immensity, the nothingness, the implacableness, the weakness of it all. It was everything he could ever conceive and nothing, and then something was rolling him onto his back. Red eyes and the face that had once been Dearborn looked down at him, and he saw the broad-bladed knife rising. Blood for the sauce, sauce for the goose, goose for the pie, pie for the stomach, stomach for the body, and growth for the new beast, the beast that will consume all. Dearborn's voice wasn't something Jeff heard. It throbbed through his body, echoed through his mind. And the blade reached its apex. It hovered and began to plunge toward Jeff's chest. The light that was not glinted off the cutting edges of the knife flashed from its tip, and Jeff tried to recoil away from it even as he arched his torso upward to meet it. He fled and he ran forward, and in his motions his hand came to rest on something on his right hip, his sidearm. Instinct for life struggled against the blessed curse of the sirens calling him down into eternity of tortured oblivion, and the joy that never-ending suffering would bring as his sanity drained into insanity that bred new understanding. Somehow, somewhere, his pistol came up, and real light shattered the light that was not, once, twice, 3 times. Dearborn's eyes widened, flashed to white, then he fell onto his back on the ground, the knife skittering away from his limp grasp. Jeff pushed himself up, and the oven was still firing, the pie above still glowing, and he knew what he had to do. Leaving his pistol behind, he reached up and took the disc, stumbled over to the edge of the oven, and tossed the disc within. Reality erupted into fire and light, real light. A titanic impact to his chest sent him stumbling backward, and he struck something hard. Light, white and true, but also red-orange as the not light fought against it, scoured his being, and his mind opened to shades of color he had never conceived of before. Flashes of flavor that fired his tongue for the blasphemy of even conceiving them. Knowledge that spanned all eternity and the infinite expanse of existence collided with his mind, and he screamed. He screamed long and long until he could hear no more. Then blackness claimed him, and he knew only a cursed and blessed oblivion. His orderly led the way to holding cell number 4, and Dr. Rakawi had to fight back annoyance at the man's slow pace. But he could not scold the man, not today, not in front of his visitors. Akawi looked back at the half-dozen faces following them, influential and brilliant minds from the foremost institute of psychiatric research, and he felt a warm glow of pride within himself. The most eminent minds of his profession come to see his unique patient, hear of Akawi's diagnosis and his methods of treatment for this most unusual case. After this, Akawi would be able to write his own ticket, wherever he went. Finally, they stopped at the small window, looking into the padded holding cell, and Akawi stepped to the side, gesturing toward the window for his visitors to look in. Detective Jeffrey Mosby, formerly a well-decorated officer, committed here after murdering one of his fellow officers in cold blood and then burning down an entire city block in the worst case of arson this state has seen in 50 years. He went on to describe the symptoms of Mosby's affliction, which led him to make his diagnosis, and his visitors gave him due attention. Within, the patient sat in a straitjacket, his legs tucked Indian style and his head lolled back so it rested against the padding of the wall, and his eyes fixed on a point at the far corner of the ceiling. He focused on something no one else could see, stared at it unblinking. His mouth moved, and soft words came out, almost too soft to hear. Bless he who walks in the shadows of the blood and the fist of heaven, who comes on the winds of shadow, in the sweetness of this hour, and the twisting of the straight, may he never fail in his oblivion through the winds. After several minutes, Akawi and his companions walked away to the next patient, though they wouldn't care about that one, and Jeff remained. Somewhere. So, the week that I wrote this story, I was having trouble deciding what to write about. So I asked my son, what should I write the story about? And he said, Lovecraftian horror and pizza. So, there it is. I think it turned out pretty fun. Sucks to be Detective Jeff, but I don't know. Who knows? Well, maybe he saved the world. Apparently. If you read Lovecraft, he's what that genre does to people who, in that stories, encounters those whatever they are. And I think it's safe to say that I'm not Lovecraft, and this isn't a Lovecraft story, obviously, but similar concept of the beings that he was dueling, and it tends to shatter one's mind. So who knows if he'll ever come back? Hopefully he doesn't have too bad of a time, I guess. Well, on the bright side, he saved the world. Yay! All right, so as you can tell, we are back into the storytime groove. We will continue to do so now that I've got undug from some jackassery that was partially self-inflicted, partially life-happening things. But we're back in the swing of things now. For this and for another thing I'm talking about in a second. But before I forget, so next week we are going to do Story Saturday again. We're doing the next story from last year's Volume 1, and this is Crowned Emperor. This is a story about the Korathi Empire, which is a empire in science fiction setting that I've been writing about for a long time. And the concept for that was basically I was thinking about the old Voltron cartoons. And what if Prince Lothar didn't know that he was the prince of the evil empire? Because how would he know? He's just the normal empire for him, right? So, and that sparked the first story in that setting, novella called Veritas Morte, which, if you've been around, you've probably seen that I've had it for a while, and you should read it. If you haven't read it, you should. Anyway, so we'll be reading this next story, Crowned Emperor, is in that same setting, and you could probably guess what some of it's about. Anyway, what else is going on that I need to talk to you about? That's right. The other reason that we are in the swing of things is we have another Kickstarter. Yay! We have, in fact, an awesome Kickstarter. All my Kickstarters are awesome. But this one is great because it's the next novel in the Glimmer Chronicles. Woo! Those of you who know me, know my books, know and love the Glimmer Chronicles. And we have got volume number 7 just about ready to go, and so we're kickstarting it. We started that Kickstarter campaign on Tuesday of this week. It has already passed the first funding goal, but we need your help to get even more money. Money. That's what we're here for. So that's the reason I do these videos and podcasts, is obviously to spread the word about my work, see if, let people sample it, and see if they like it. And if they like it, that they should think, oh man, I like that guy's work. I should go buy some books. That's the purpose of this. The other purpose of this is things like Kickstarter. Kickstarter is going on right now. We are now past the first goal, going towards the stretch goals. All assistance is both required and desired. So get over there. I'm going to put the link up here underneath me. michaelkingswood.com/bardkick. That will get you to there, and you must go. You must go and support the campaign, or else. Other things you must do is go buy books. Not just the Glimmer Vale books on the Kickstarter, but from my bookstore, michaelkingswood.com/store. You can find all of my stuff that I have in pretty much any format you want. And you don't have to go through the middleman. Come straight to me, which means I get more money and you get a direct relationship with the writer who you like. Awesome. Especially as how capricious tech companies are, and you've seen it. Better to cast out the middleman if we can. And we can. That said, if you like those middlemen, Amazon, Barnes Noble, Kobo, iBooks, Google Play, everybody that you think of and more, you can go to michaelkingswood.com/books to read, the number 2. That'll get you to Universal Book Click Aggregator, which will allow you to pick a title, click on it, and you can select which store you want to go to. And it won't link to my store. It'll link to all the normal retail stores, which is kind of annoying. But that's why we have the separate link for it, so you can go to the retail stores if you want. So do that. Back to Kickstarter, buy some other books, and come back next week. Next week, we are going to read another story, and it'll be great, and you'll like it. We'll all have fun. I will see you then. Until then, don't do anything I wouldn't do.